Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to another episode of Vertical Stars Podcast fourth season. How my loyal listeners, thank you for continued support. Enjoy this amazing interview because Cameron Dawson Kim boards the mothership to discuss the classic Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 1990 film. This is part one of a two-part episode. Now come aboard to go traversing the stars.
All right. Cowabunga, dude.
Hello, Mr. Dawson, and I want to thank you so much for coming to the Vertical Stars Podcast. As I said off air, the Turtle movie that we're going to talk about from 1990 is one of the watershed moments of my childhood, and I want to thank you so much for being such an important part of it.
Well, thank you for having me, Jeff. I appreciate it.
So my pleasure. And like I said, I always start off with a question of inspiration. So what inspired your love for film and who are your earliest influences?
Well, I grew up with four brothers, and I'm old, so I went to the movies in the 50s when you could still go to the movies and have a double feature at noon, and most of those films were westerns, whether it was Hopalong Cassidy or those kinds of things. And then as I got a little older, I started to get into I love Stanley Kubrick's films. I don't know why. I guess maybe 2001 Space Odyssey was the most impactful later on. But I went to college in Massachusetts, and we had a small theater there. So I used to go down and watch. This is in the late 60s. So everything from Alice B. Toklas to, oh, I don't know, gee whiz. But regardless, I kind of like. I grew up in Southern California, a very outdoor kind of life. So movies to me weren't as big a part of my life and television. We never watched television growing up until my dad actually got a color TV, which was a piece of plastic that he put over the black and white screen with blue on the top and brown in the middle and green on the bottom, right? That was our first color TV. But yeah, I've always been a fan of not just action films, but films that had some kind of sensibility to it that gave you a sense of either belonging or spoke to the audience in a new way. The big action films like the Marvel stuff and all that, I don't necessarily relate so much to that as I do more dramatic and films that have I guess more gravitas, more meaning to them. Not to say that those big action films don't, but the Turtles were, that was a totally different sort of genre than I'd ever been involved in previously, because most of my career was spent in television. I worked at TWI to begin with, and then which was a sports television company, and now IMG Sports, but TWI did legitimate sports, which I grew up playing baseball and later rugby and things like that. I love sports, and so working for TWI, I got to do uh, the Masters, golf, Wimbledon, tennis, things of that nature, legitimate sports,
Hmm.
as well as car racing, downhill skiing, and that sort of thing. But TWI basically cut its teeth and became known for creating television, what we called underwear sports, reality television back in the day, which Battle of the Network Stars, Challenge of the Sexes, Survival of the Fittest, World Series of Poker, World's Strongest Men, things of that nature that were all made up, made for television, but took advantage of athletes and superstars. Was one of the big shows in the 70s, and today you couldn't do that show because of the liabilities associated with it.
Hmm.
Um, Whereas certain shows like I think World's Strongest Men is still being in production, right? And I think the
Hmm.
World Series of Poker is still in
Yeah.
production. Those are all shows that got created back in those what I call the halcyon days of TV, because those were, I mean, the gloves were off, particularly when I moved from TWI over to Showtime. My boss at TWI had taken a position at Showtime just as it was starting to launch. This is when Showtime and HBO were still both owned by Time Warner
Hmm.
at the time. The government made them split, and Showtime ended up under the Viacom CBS brand. But and that was in 1980. I moved and that's when I really developed an interest in more dramatic television. I did a lot of comedy and music and that sort of thing, but I also did dramatic series like The Paper Chase and Brothers, the first film that or the first television series about AIDS that was ever produced.
Mm.
Um, and I think that's sort of it really got my juices flowing about getting doing more narrative feature films. Just as I was leaving California, Gary called me and said, "Listen, we were in the middle of preparing a new Gallagher special. Anyway, Gary was there, and wherever Gary went, he was always on the lookout for comic books. He had acquired at that point the rights to Scout War Shaman. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Timothy Truman was a great cartoonist and a comic book author. Um, Scout War Shaman, Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, Kitchen Sink, and Dark Horse Comics,
Mm.
which are now much bigger brands today. But they at that time they were small, independent kind of cult-like books or comics brands. And Gary sort of wherever he'd go to comic book stores and grab comics and the latest issues. And he went into a place called Midnight Comics down the street from the Fox Theater, and he found the first issue of the Turtles. Now, I think it had been published originally in 85 or 86 and then but it had made its way west to Detroit by that time. Uh, and that's what Gary bought every copy there was in the store and sent me a pile of them by FedEx overnight. And I remember when he called that day, I was in the office with his wife and a guy named Gabe Sachs. Gabe Sachs ended up being one of the writers on Freaks and Geeks,
Mm.
um, and now is a very established showrunner. He did a show. Gabe is well known in Hollywood. Very, very prolific writer and producer. And when Gary called us, he was going on and on about these turtles and the costumes and how we could. I'm going, Gary, what have you been smoking, dude? Because he was not
Mm.
afraid of smoking virtually anything. Um, but I went, I don't know what you're talking about. So the next day when I got the comics, I could see where he was going with this, that we could put comedians in these comics in these suits or their voices rather, and let them do what they do, right? Um, Ultimately, that was, and then the early comics that Kevin and Peter produced were pretty dark. If
Mm.
you've read through those comics, you realize there's not a lot of levity in them, right?
Right.
But Gary, being the comic producer that he was and manager, he managed all sorts of people in Las Vegas and all that. And he was really into the entertainment side, the fun side of what the Turtles were all about. And I remember him going shouting at me, "Cowabunga, dude, cowabunga," because that was a surf term back in the day, right? It was I don't know where that originally derived from. Um, I went back and looked to see if I could find the reference in the early versions of the comic, and I'm not sure I did. I know when we started writing the screenplay, Cowabunga became a big part of the dialogue, so to say. That was mostly Bobby Herbeck and Todd, coming up with those lines. But so as it went on, I got the comics the next day. I saw where he was going, his vision, and we I called Mirage and talked to Kevin and Peter, and they said we just signed a deal with Mark Fried. Mark ran Surge Licensing, and Surge Licensing was Mark and Renee Friedman, probably at that time just a small independent group. He was working with MCA Universal in the New York office of MCA and did licensing of various things for their various intellectual properties, Universal Studios. And he had been up to he'd seen a copy of the comic. He'd been up to Northampton a couple of weeks before I called and had signed a deal literally on the back of a napkin. You hear these stories, but it's true. Um, and Mark at that time, the Mark and or Peter and Kevin had, I think they had made one license. They had these little tin soldiers that were the turtles. I don't know if you've ever seen those toys. We had a set of them. Gary had a set of them at one point, but those little tin soldiers that you got. Well, somebody decided to make them as turtles, and there was a set of them with Splinter that were pretty cool, but they were lead,
Mm.
right? So they weren't really a toy for kids. They were collectors, I guess. I don't know what you'd say, but as we're starting to get into the late 80s, people are more concerned with safety and
Mm.
all of that. So you end up with that toy, which I don't know sold particularly a lot. But the comic was starting to go off, and Mark recognized that. And to give you some context, if Mark signed his deal in late 87, um, by the time the movie came out, in March of 1990, 2.5 years later, he had almost 800 licenses in place.
Oh, wow.
A lot of that sprung from the Playmates deal, because when I first met Mark, he had just signed Playmate, who was looking for a toy line that they could take advantage of, and that's really the Turtles made Playmate the success that it has been. Yeah, so this is the big NECA toy, and then the little guy. Um, but they do much more authentic, like the original Playmate toys. They've, since Nickelodeon took over that license, they turned me on to Mark, and I negotiated a deal with Mark, which was papered by my attorney, a guy named Jay Shanker, who worked with a guy named Tom Rowan, who was the son of Dan Rowan from Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. And Tom concentrated on television, and Jay was more expert at film legal. So Jay took us by the reins and kind of walked us through that process. We had an 18-month actually, it was a 12-month option on the property that we paid a very small amount for relative to what they're worth now,
Mm.
as to get that option for 12 months. And we nearly ran out. I think when we finally signed the contract, we had less than a month left on our option when we finally signed the contract with Golden Harvest. But immediately, as soon as we got those, before I left town to go to Florida, we pitched it to everybody. We started with Peter Chernin, who was my boss at Showtime, who had now moved over to Lorimar and ran Lorimar Studios, which was the company that produced Dallas, among other things. But he was running that studio. Peter went back and ran 20th Century Fox for many years, and now he has his own production company. But Peter was our first pitch, and he went, no. Keep in mind that Garbage Pail Kids had just failed, and Howard the Duck had just failed. Both big time, box office busts.
Now, can I have a question about that? When you were pitching it, was it definitely going to be pitched as live action, or was there a cartoon potential as well, or was it definitely going to be a live
No,
action?
we only had live action rights. The way
Okay.
it worked was that um, Playmate, when they first signed the contract, they went to a company called Murakami and Wolf, and they produced a 5 episode series of half-hour cartoons. And if you've ever seen those cartoons, they're the best that have ever been done by far as I'm concerned. They were they really stayed close to the original vision. They didn't and the whole way they animated and all those was as good as it gets for children's television. Now those launched at Christmas of 87, and Playmate by that time had those 5 episodes, and they also had a really great press kit, which we then used, and we had early versions of the toys as well. Toy Fair happened in February of 88, and that's where they announced the toys to the world at Toy Fair at the Javits Center in New York. That ultimately was the one of the biggest PR sensations of that time because they blew a manhole cover off, steam came out, and the turtles jumped out of the sewer and went into the hall. And that was the early versions of the costumes, well before Henson got involved. I don't know what where they had gotten those costumes, but somehow Playmate managed to, figure out those costumes and again, and it was a huge sensation. They took the toy fair by storm that year. And by June, when the toys actually released in in the stores, they flew off the shelves because the kids had been watching those cartoons. It was on Great Western TV, a syndicator who syndicated it all over the country, and they kept repeating the 5 episodes because they were so popular. So every week on Saturday morning there'd be a new turtle episode or a new old turtle episode of those 5. Now later on they produced a lot more episodes, but those 5 still stand out as the best. But we only had live action rights, and that was fine with Gary and I. We because Gary really felt like we needed to lighten the mood, and Playmates was the same way. Playmates was going for a young audience, and the dark part of the comic, if you looked at some of the early Batman stuff and all that, that was all dark and very sort of, violent and so forth. And actually that worked against us while we were pitching it because people thought, oh no, it's going to be, it's kung fu, it's karate and all that. We even went to Jerry Weintraub, who had done Three Ninjas, right? And he went, no way, dudes. And it really the influence of Garbage Pail Kids and Howard the Duck and those failures had really soured the marketplace on live action pictures based on comic book characters,
Mm.
except for the huge ones like Superman and Batman, and this was really before Marvel became a thing, right?
Mm.
Um, but we pitched literally every studio because of my early connection at Disney Channel, having done that show. Patrick Davidson was the exec in charge of production or the head of production for Disney Channel. And I asked him if he'd be interested in the Turtles. He said, well, let me call Jeffrey Katzenberg because he runs Disney Animation and
Mm.
see if he'd be interested. And Jeffrey called back and said, no, not interested. It's going to be a failure. You can count on it, right? And that was true even when we put the film out to critics for review. They hated it. They panned it. And I'll fill in that story because it's really cool. But
Uh, but it was funny. I remember because I had a book called all the Leonard Maltin, all the reviews that he ever did. It was in a book, and I remember Teenage Mutant Turtles had a turkey, and
yeah,
his response was, I think, literally said, "I always remember this." He said, "This is about the best, I guess, a movie about turtles can be." He gave it a turkey. I was like, something that stuck in my memory forever because for some reason I always remember that being a review for that,
yeah,
which I loved. So I thought it was kind of
yeah,
fun. This is about the best, I guess, you're gonna get with talking turtles.
yeah. Well, I think that unfortunately, everybody was real literal and they didn't see the connection that kids could make with these turtles. And Peter and Kevin they're genius, and I must say because they struck a nerve with both young people and college age kids
Mm.
who were comic book fans, big time comic book fans. And when once you connected them with the 2 screenwriters, Bobby Herbeck and Todd Langen, uh, it became they brought the humor to it
Mm.
that had not been there in the early editions. But the story was kind of an amalgam of I think the first 3 or 4 issues of the comic book.
Mm.
Um, and that became a source of a great deal of fun. But we got those rights, and then we started pitching, and that's when I had lunch with Bobby Herbeck, who ended up writing the first draft of the screenplay. And Bobby was an old friend of mine. He was working with Golden Harvest at the time,
Mm.
but we didn't think Golden Harvest was big enough. So we kept going around and around and around. And there's that old T.S. Eliot quote that we never cease from exploration, and we arrive at the place we started and know it for the first time.
Mm.
Right. And that's really applicable to what we did. We went all around the town of Hollywood, pitching to everybody, to Sony, to Disney, Paramount, uh, Universal, everybody. And because having worked at Showtime, I had great relationships, as did Gary, with almost anybody. Everybody was willing to take a pitch. But
Right.
when they heard comic books and live action and this and that, it was like, no. Um, so we were, not to say that we were desperate. Listen, Hollywood's basically wired to say no
Mm.
for the most part, right? They say no to no to no to everybody and everything, and then somebody may look away and take a risk. But um, you know, having worked at Showtime and knowing what that drill was and how you went through the development process, I knew what the reactions we'd get most of the time. I'm trying to remember exactly when it was. It had to be maybe April of '88. We had lunch, or yeah, at a Chinese restaurant in Westwood, and Tom just he didn't get it. He just didn't get it. And I kept saying, "But Tom, there's toys, there's all this stuff. I had them all laid out." And he goes, "Yeah, yeah, yeah." He goes, "I know all about that." He goes, "But I said, one thing, you don't have to have big actors in these costumes. You don't have to pay a lot of money for the actors. You just have to have because it's all going to be voiceover at the end, right?" That's what we figured. And Gary had given me this whole rah-rah about comedy and making sure it was part of it. And Tom went home and talked to the babysitter that night and heard from the babysitter that the turtle toys were actually a pretty big thing and that the kids really liked them. So he said, "Okay, I'll call the guy who owns um, uh, uh, Golden Harvest, whose name was um, Raymond Chow." Raymond was notorious. He had done all the movies with Bruce Lee and with Jackie Chan, and he was a very, very what would you say, aggressive Chinese businessman. Lived in Hong Kong, uh, but he happened to be over in Singapore at the time that Tom called him and said, "I want you to consider this turtle thing." And he was having lunch. This is secondhand, but I heard this from David Chan, who was his line producer, that there would always be um, an interest in doing this because we could shoot the film in China, in where they had plenty of martial artists, they had studios, they had all the drill, and they could keep the cost down. And the toys were being made in China and shipping through Singapore for the most part, Singapore and Hong Kong. And he had lunch with the mayor of Singapore and says, "What do you know about the turtles?" And the guy says, The toys are pouring through our port. They're everywhere. Playmates has made a big indent, on our shipping and this and that." So he reconsidered and said, "Okay, I'll consider it." Um, but the one proviso that Raymond Chow made was that, and they had just done Smokey and the Bandit. That was the big claim to fame that they had, and they said, under no circumstances do I make this movie without distribution. Well, Tom Gray had been working as the foreign sales rep for Fox Studios for a number of years, and how he got. That's how he started in the business, was on the distribution side, and he made a deal with Fox to distribute the movie worldwide. And that was enough for Raymond Chow to sign the check and get Steve Barron on board. And we all agreed on a budget of 8.5 million. We were scheduled to start on like July 5th or 6th in uh, what's that, Wilmington, North Carolina, at the Screen Gem Studios is where we were shooting. And I think the schedule called for prep to start in April, which we did. the prep and the Henson moved all his creature shop from London to Wilmington and brought all those people over, and they started finishing the manufacturing of the con, and everything was going. We got the film was all cast, ready to go, and on about May 1st, Tom Gray got a call from the folks at Fox, and it turns out that um, uh, Les Goldberg, yeah, who was the president of Fox at the time, got fired and replaced by a guy named Barry Diller. Barry Diller went on to form Hotel.com, and I think he was one of the very first people on the e-commerce side of the world. But Barry Diller at that point had run studios and had been in the business. He was a big deal. And when he came into Fox to run Fox, he wiped the slate clean and said, "Get rid of everything, including those turtles. We don't want them." So back to, Tom Gray and Raymond Chow, who said no, no distribution, no movie. So we scrambled. I can remember getting the call from Tom going, we gotta come up with an answer. And he went back to Bob Shea, who would pitched early on to distribute the picture. Bob Shea was the president of New Line, right? And he at first the first time we went to him, he said, no, 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 it'll never work. And then when we went back, it was the same story. His kids had the toys. His babysitter was like, okay, yeah, I like it. So he capitulated and he said, insofar as you guys have already, you've got the budget for the movie. We Mark Friedman had done magic with licensing, had gotten Ralston Purina to create a cereal, and Burger King to do the promotion about the movie where they give away videos, right? And all of that kind of congealed at the same time. So when we went back to them, we said, you only have to put up P&A, but the P&A is augmented by almost $20 million worth of promotion that we already have in place.
Right.
They saw the value of all of that and realized that it was going to work. So they agreed that they would distribute, and then we went back. Prep started again and got finished, and we started shooting the first right after the 4th of July. But I'm sure you've heard stories about Wilmington and how I would call it barbaric it was. There were no air conditioners on the stages. Only these what are called heat exchangers, which try to suck out the hot air. But because there's nothing but hot air in Wilmington, North Carolina in July, and about 100-degree humidity, there's nothing you can do. It was hot. And the way that manifested was in particular was, I mean, everybody had to adjust. Once you work outdoors in humidity, you get used to it. The things that didn't get used to it were the costumes.
Hmm.
The costumes had been built and designed at the Creature Shop in London in nice 60-degree weather, and now we're in the high 90s with humidity at the same level. And these guys, even though the suits had these cooling systems in them, there was under the shell of the talking turtles, there had to be, I don't know how many motors, little, RC servos, and they were meant to pump water through the system to keep it cool. They were meant, and they did all the eye movement and all of that. Well, when you get humidity too high and all that, those motors stop, right? But Brian and Steve figured it out. They figured out how to shoot the movie um, with with oftentimes without the costumes working properly or whatever. But Jim and Brian had created with their tech team had created these really remarkable costumes that had what were known as Waldos. Are you familiar with that expression?
Not no.
All right, so Waldos are remote control gloves. They were originally created, the idea for Waldos were created by a science fiction writer by the name of Robert Heinlein. Robert Heinlein wrote a short story called Waldo Inc., and it was about a guy who was sent into space. He was an obese guy, but he was a great inventor. But in space, he could use his skills to create these inventions that were needed back on Earth. And in doing that, he created remote control gloves with which to do the miniature work. Well, I was a big Heinlein fan. I had books of Heinlein all over my office in Disney, and I don't know if he picked up on it that from there. I remember talking with Jim about Waldo's and whether or not that's applicable to what they do, because the puppeteers would have, you know, a remote control box with two joysticks, a right and left joystick, and all the buttons that you would normally have with radio controlled, planes or cars or boats or whatever. But he applied that technology to the puppets or to the costume characters. So underneath the talking turtles were all these servos and uh, paraphernalia that were sensitive electronics, so to say. And they decided they didn't want to work in that humidity. They took a vacation. So, what should have taken, it actually drove the budget. We had overtime that we didn't anticipate of almost $2 million because of those delays that we encountered. But somehow or another, I think that Steve Barron, who's probably the most calm director I've ever met, he's unflappable, right? Like he he would take it with a grain of salt. He'd figure out what to do next, and he and Brian were close colleagues. They were good friends, and they kind of they if it didn't work this way, they'd figure out another way for it to work. I remember one day they were shooting these scenes in the thing with those miniature turtles, with the live turtles crawling around, the story of their origin
Yeah.
story, um, which Steve and Brian said, oh, that's just temporary. It's always going to be replaced with really CGI stuff. And when Steve saw it, he said, no, it's great. It's just that. So regardless, one day they were shooting those, and we had to keep the big elephant door open in the stage, and at that time, I remember Judith talking about how the fact that she oftentimes when she was in conversations with one of the turtles, she would go, the costume wasn't working, so they'd put a C stand up with a paper plate with a smiley face and maybe the red band across it or the orange band across
Yeah.
it to determine who it was that she was talking to. But a lot of those conversations, those scenes got shot like that, right? It was a slug. But that particular day that they were shooting these, it was with a snorkel camera where it was a very technical shoot, and there was this like a table that we were shooting on top of, and there was whiteboards all around it, and a lot of light that was pressing down on it, and those lights attracted flies in the millions, like the millions. It was like thick with flies. And the only time I'd ever experienced flies like that had been in Australia once before when I was in the outback. I was and I was reminded of that, of those days, because it was so creepy. And Ryan came up with the genius idea of setting up a separate uh, lighting set. So he got all that whiteboard and put another table over here, and that attracted all the flies over there. And we cut down the lighting on the scene that we were actually shooting, and that saved the day. Brian and Steve saved the day after day. It was remarkable. Um, but as the show went along, the one the one I wasn't there at the time when they shot the farmhouse scenes, but remember those drawings
Mm.
that April is making?
Yep.
Right. Well, those drawings were Steve Barron's idea, and they were drawn by an animator that he met at some London School of Arts. He had recruited this kid kind of as an intern, but his name is Osbert Parker, and Osbert is one of the most talented animators. He's done openings of the most complicated animated openings of television shows for the BBC and well America as well. His work is everywhere, and he was the guy who who drew those original drawings. And I think he found them recently. They may be up for auction sometime soon. I'm not sure, but Osbert I think he stayed in touch with Steve, and but Steve, as you know, this upcoming Fathom event that happens to the 15th through the 21st,
Mm.
where they're going to show the movies at theaters. I think it's over 1,000 screens now. Um, Steve Barron has some unseen footage that has been talked about for years and years and years, and it's going to be shown as the added value content.
Very
You heard it here
cool.
first, right? That's one of the reasons why you got to go see the movie, because you're going to see stuff that's never been seen before. So real turtle fans will truly appreciate this, because I think I haven't seen it because they've been keeping it under wraps, but it may include the final scene of the movie that was written but never shown, which was um, um, April in the office of and Casey Jones in the office of a comic book publisher, where they were trying to get the movie, and they were using these drawings to show to the comic book publisher, who kept saying, "No way, no way, it'll never work, it'll never work." This was sort of like the mantra that we all laughed at.
Yeah.
But you know, so that we finished production in August of that year. I think probably late August, maybe some reshoots in September, and then Steve came back to Los Angeles and started editing. I stayed in Orlando, um, and as he was editing, he got about, I want to say, 7/8 of the way done with the movie. He hadn't finished the score, and he still wanted to do some work. He had some reshoots he really wanted to do, but as it turns out, at the time, the editing team was working over at a studio near Disney, and the lady who ran the Mouse Club was now in charge of the Mouse Club, as exec in charge of production, the same job I'd had at Showtime. And I didn't know her because I'd already left the Mouse Club by the time she got assigned to it. Had heard about, and her husband was the editor of the movie, or working the editor. I think he was assistant editor, because Sally was the primary editor. And somehow or another, she got wind of the fact that this movie was almost done, and she invited Jeffrey Katzenberg to see the movie, right, in rough cut. Well, or arranged for it. And Steve and his producer, Simon Fields, and Sally, and all signed off on the fact that, well, yeah, let him come in and see the movie in kind of in secret, because it was not a good move on Steve's part to show the movie to anybody in the industry before it was seen by those of us who owned it or worked on it, whatever. And I was sitting in Tom Gray's office. I had gone out to Los Angeles to see it, to see the film in its rough cut stage, and we were planning. I was planning to go see it like a day later, and I was in Tom Gray's office at Golden Harvest in Beverly Hills, and he gets a call from Jeffrey Katzenberg. Katzenberg goes, "Would you be interested in Disney distributing your picture?" And Tom very calmly said, "Jeffrey, that's very kind of you." He said, "Well, you like it?" And he goes, "I liked it very much. I think it'll do well." And Tom said, "Well, thank you, but no, I think we'll stick with New Line. They're pretty far down the line. They're planning their release and all this." And this was really kind of his, he was holding back, because as soon as he hung up with Jeffrey, he picked up the phone and called the attorney, his attorney, not mine, and said, "Fire Steve Barron and the editor and anybody associated with them. They're done." Uh, because in Tom's mind, it jeopardized the project.
Hmm.
Because if Jeffrey had gotten a hold of it and had seen it and not liked it, it's likely that he could have said something to the mark or whatever. But it was a breach of contract relative to thing. And Tom and Steve had been fighting almost since day one anyway over the budget and just give me a couple extra days. Steve is a fantastic filmmaker and was really stuck into this story. And that I remember Todd Langen saying to me that was the after Todd took over from Bobby and did a redraft or a rewrite, and only he and Steve were involved in that rewrite. The two of them. They sat in the room and they did it. I think it took them about 3 weeks to do the rewrite, which was what the film that actually got shot, the script that got shot. Um, and nobody interfered with them. It was like there were no studio execs to tell them. And, I had a copy of it and I thought it was great. So what am I going to say, right? These guys know what they're doing. I've never shot a feature film before. I know narrative, and I did a lot of storyline notes when I worked at Showtime, but this was a totally different new world to me. So my observation was let the experts do what they do. I'm going to learn what I can.
Hmm.
And I was able to apply my business, acumen to the process, but creatively there was plenty of creativity around it. They didn't need me. So as it turns out, they were the two of them just they finished the script and that's what got shot, and nobody interfered with that. Todd then wrote number two as well after it got picked up, and he said then it was writing by committee. It was not just him and the director Green who directed Ooze, Mike. I can't remember right off the top of my head, but I remember it was the director, Tom Gray, of course, and somebody else at Golden Harvest, the toy company. There were about 10 people all weighing in. New Line was weighing in. It has to be this, has to do that. You got to product place this, and pizza and all that. And the first film was like virgin of all that. It had none of that stuff. Even though the pizza scene in that uh, was a good product placement, I don't think they ever monetized that in the first film. But regardless, Steve got fired. And I think, I've heard some interviews with him where he and Simon both said it was a big mistake. We shouldn't have done that. But it happened. And that's what happened. They also fired the editor, Sally, who went on to have an amazing career, rest her soul, with Quentin Tarantino. She was she was his go-to editor for, Pulp Fiction, all that stuff for years.
Hmm.
And so it wasn't lack of talent. Uh, but the bottom line was that Steve and Simon and Sally and Brian didn't get to finish the movie the way they wanted to.
Hmm.
I think, it's debatable whether the score would have changed. It might have. I think the original songs in the score are great, but some of the score, in my opinion, probably could have been richer and deeper and all that. But, it was at that time, Tom was trying to save money. He was not interested in spending a huge amount of money to create a soundtrack, even though the soundtrack ultimately did really well.
I
Um,
bought the cassette. I remember having the cassette when it came out in '90.
yeah, Richard Usher was great, and John, who was the composer, it was a great score. Don't get me wrong, but I think had Steve had more chance, because Steve loved music, he would have worked the music in it more. But he was gone, and it was very contentious. Well, a month later, they finally had a rough cut. And I remember we went, Gary was with Gallagher in Las Vegas. I flew out to Las Vegas, and we had a screening. New Line did a test screening of the movie at a theater in right on the Strip. Um, and it was a big 300 seat theater at the time. And it was probably 90% kids under 12, right? And it went off. The test scores were like in the 96th, 97th percentile. People
Hmm.
were like going crazy. And even the parents who filled out the cards were going, yeah, we like it. It was great. It was really exciting and fun and, engaging and all that stuff. And I remember Mitch Goldman, who was the head of, worked with Sarah Risher at New Line at the time. Mitch was one of his jobs was in the distribution side was ordering prints, and at the time they had cleared 1,200 screens to release in March. I remember he walked across the lobby, got onto a payphone. There were still payphones in those days, and called Fuji Labs in London. It was bright and early in the morning in London, and doubled the print order to 2,400 prints. And that's because we knew at that time that it was going to go off. Gary and I, that's the first time Gary and I had seen the movie, project. I'd seen it in the small edit room, but I hadn't seen it projected on the big screen. And the reaction of the kids, they laughed in all the right places. They were cheering and all that. So we went home at Christmas that year of 1989, pretty